The year was 1945, and Germany was unrecognizable. What had once been a nation of proud cities, bustling markets, and churches with bells ringing on Sunday mornings was now a scarred landscape of rubble. Allied bombers had reduced entire neighborhoods to ash. Railways lay twisted, bridges blown apart, rivers clogged with debris. Hunger gnawed at every household. For the civilians who had survived years of war, life had narrowed to three things: finding food, finding shelter, and fearing what tomorrow might bring. Mothers clutched children, fathers gone to battle or dead, and rumors traveled faster than truth. The most frightening rumors were about the Americans. Propaganda posters had painted them as monsters, brutal invaders who would chain prisoners, starve civilians, and worse. Radio broadcasts repeated the message endlessly. Teachers whispered it to students. Mothers, desperate to protect their little ones, passed on the same warnings. "When the Americans come," they said, "hide. Do not look them in the eye. Do not take their food. Death is better than dishonor." Greta, a widow of 32, had repeated these words many times. Her husband, Hans, had died on the Eastern Front. Since then, she had lived with her two sons, Karl and Lukas, in what remained of a bakery her family once owned. The roof was half collapsed, ovens shattered, but it gave them walls against the wind. Karl, at 9, was already too thin. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes large. Lukas, only 6, carried a persistent cough that frightened Greta in the cold nights. They lived on scraps of turnips and thin soup made from boiled weeds. Bread was a dream. Sugar was a memory. On a grey morning in March, the sound of engines thundered through their ruined town near the Rhine. Greta froze. Karl ran to the broken window. "Mama! Soldiers!" Her heart sank. American convoys filled the street. Tanks, jeeps, trucks loaded with men. The ground trembled under their weight. Mothers pulled children inside cellars. Doors slammed shut. The old baker across the street crossed himself. Greta grabbed Karl and Lukas, pulling them to the cellar. "Stay silent!" she hissed. The boys trembled, pressing against her. In her mind, she imagined what would come: boots pounding on doors, hands pulling them out, chains locking around wrists. She prayed it would be quick. Outside, the convoy halted in the town square. Boots crunched on rubble. Voices barked in English, harsh foreign sounds. Greta pressed her sons close, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. Then came a softer noise, the crinkle of paper, the laughter of children. Greta blinked, confused. What laughter could there be now? She crept to the cellar door, cracked it open, and peered out. What she saw made no sense. An American soldier, kneeling in the square, held out a small brown bar. A boy from the village reached for it hesitantly, his mother clutching his shoulder in alarm. The soldier broke it in half, offered it again. The boy sniffed, then bit. His eyes widened, his lips curved. He whispered a single word that spread like fire through the square. "Chocolat." Chocolate. Children gasped. Mothers stared in disbelief. The Americans pulled more bars from their packs, rectangles wrapped in plain brown paper stamped with English letters. Hershey's. One by one, children reached out. Some cried as sweetness touched their tongues for the first time in years. For many, it was their very first chocolate. Their mothers had almost forgotten its taste themselves. Greta's son Karl tugged her arm. "Mama, please." She shook her head, fear locking her chest. But when an American crouched before them, smiling faintly, and offered a bar, Karl could not resist. He peeled back the paper and bit, his face lit with joy. Greta wept. She had prepared him for chains. Instead, he tasted chocolate. That night, the cellar buzzed with whispers. Families clutched wrappers like holy relics, smelling the faint sweetness again and again. Children licked crumbs from their palms. Mothers argued. "It is a trick," said Anna, Greta's neighbor. "First they give sweetness, then they demand more." but Greta held Carl as he slept, chocolate still on his breath. She whispered to herself, "If this is a trick, it is the cruelest one of all, because it gave him joy." The fear had not vanished, but something else had entered too: confusion, doubt, and a sweetness she could not forget. The morning after the first Hershey bars were handed out, the town stirred with unease. People emerged from cellars slowly, blinking in the grey daylight, expecting to find punishment waiting. Instead, the American soldiers were still there, jeeps idling, helmets catching the light. Children peeked from behind mothers' skirts, their eyes darting toward the soldiers' packs as though searching for magic. Greta kept her boys close. Carl still clutched a scrap of the wrapper from last night, folded neatly like treasure. He pulled it out, showing Lucas. "It smelled like sugar," he whispered. "Maybe they have more." "Do not hope for such things," Greta warned sharply. But her voice cracked. She remembered Carl's smile, wide for the first time in months. It haunted her. In the square, a group of American soldiers had set up a field kitchen. The smell of hot coffee and bacon drifted over rubble-strewn streets, curling through broken windows. Civilians inhaled deeply, their stomachs growling, but none dared approach. The propaganda whispered in their ears still, "The enemy will trick you, the enemy will shame you." But hunger was louder than fear. By noon, a small crowd gathered hesitantly at the edge of the square. Mothers, thin and wary. Children, barefoot and hollow-cheeked. Greta was among them, her sons tugging at her dress. One American soldier noticed. He said something in English, waved them forward. The civilians froze. Then the interpreter, a German-speaking soldier, repeated, "Come, you will not be harmed." Still, they hesitated. Then a soldier reached into his pocket, pulled out another chocolate bar, and held it up. The children surged forward. Greta's heart pounded. She wanted to pull Carl back, but his small hand slipped from hers. He ran toward the soldier, Lucas stumbling behind. Greta braced for cruelty, for laughter, for mockery. Instead, the soldier crouched and handed them each a bar. Carl tore his open with shaking fingers, bit into the square, and closed his eyes in bliss. Lucas nibbled carefully, then broke off a piece and offered it to his mother. Greta stared at the tiny brown square in her hand. She hadn't tasted chocolate since before the war. Her husband used to bring her wrapped truffles on their anniversary. She lifted it to her lips and bit. Sweetness exploded across her tongue. Tears sprang to her eyes. It was more than chocolate. It was memory. It was life before war. The spread of sweetness, word spread quickly. By evening, children were running through alleys shouting, "The Americans give chocolate." At first, some parents refused to believe it. "It is bait," one man muttered. "Sugar first, then chains." But when he saw his daughter clutching a bar, cheeks sticky with melted chocolate, his certainty faltered. Day after day, the soldiers handed out sweets, sometimes gum, sometimes canned milk, but always chocolate. The civilians began to call the Americans the chocolate soldiers. The mothers debate. One night in the cellar, mothers argued. "They feed us to win us over," Anna said bitterly. "Do not forget they destroyed our city." "But they gave food," Greta countered softly. She looked at her sons asleep on the floor, wrappers clutched in their fists. "My boys smile again. Does that not matter?" Anna snapped. "Smiles will not rebuild our homes." "No," Greta agreed. "But maybe they will rebuild our hearts." The women fell silent. A soldier's gesture. One afternoon, Greta watched an American soldier sit on the fountain's edge. Children gathered timidly. He unwrapped a bar, broke it into pieces, and handed them out evenly. When one girl cried because she was too late, he broke his own piece in half and gave it to her. The girl beamed. She ran to her mother, shouting, "He shared his!" Greta felt something shift inside her. She had been prepared for cruelty, prepared for chains, but she had not been prepared for kindness. Kindness was harder to endure because it stripped away the hatred that had protected her heart. The flower of doubt, days stretched into weeks. The civilians began to linger in the square openly, no longer hiding. Children played near the soldiers' jeeps, hoping for sweets. Mothers, still wary, accepted rations of bread and canned food. One day Greta noticed Karl carefully folding a wrapper into the shape of a flower. He tucked it into his pocket, proud of his creation. "Why a flower?" Greta asked. "Because flowers grow, Mama," Karl said, "even in rubble." Her throat tightened. She realized he had found hope where she had only found despair. Rumors and guilt. Not everyone welcomed the chocolate. Some men muttered angrily, "Do you not see? They bribe our children. They make us forget who we are." One elder spat on the ground when he saw a boy chewing. "Shame. You eat from the enemy's hand." But the children did not care. Hunger was stronger than pride. Sweetness was stronger than hatred. Greta wrestled with guilt. She remembered Hans, her husband, dying somewhere in the east, fighting the same men who now gave chocolate to her sons. She whispered to herself at night, "Forgive me, Hans, forgive me for letting them taste." But when she saw Karl's eyes light up, she could not regret it. The first smile. Weeks later, Greta realized something astonishing. She had laughed. Karl had smeared chocolate across his cheek, Lucas trying to lick it off. Greta burst into laughter before she could stop herself. The sound startled her. It had been years since such a sound left her throat. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming. "I am still human," she whispered. For the first time since the war began, she believed it. A memory preserved. That night, Greta carefully flattened a wrapper and tucked it into her apron pocket. She knew it would not last, the sweetness gone. But the memory was enough. When her sons asked why she kept it, she said simply, "So I will never forget the day you smiled again." The meaning of chocolate. Historians would later write of battles and treaties, bombs and surrenders. But for Greta and the other mothers, history was not measured in grand events. It was measured in a simple bar of chocolate. They had braced for chains. Instead, they received sweetness. And in that small act, the enemy became human. The war ended in fragments. First, whispers, then rumors. Then the announcement, carried by interpreters and posted notices. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was gone. For the civilians who had lived in terror, the words meant little at first. Bombs had already stopped. Men were already gone. Hunger was still here. In Greta's town, life carried on beneath American occupation. Soldiers patrolled streets, but their rifles were mostly slung. Field kitchens served food not only to troops, but sometimes to children who gathered nearby. And always, chocolate appeared. Karl and Lucas no longer flinched at the sight of uniforms. When they heard the rumble of a jeep, they ran to the roadside, waiting, hoping. Greta tried to hold them back, whispering warnings, but she no longer believed them herself. The enemy had fed her sons, not with bread, not with chains, but with sweetness, and that sweetness had become a lifeline. The day of release. By summer, civilians were told they could move freely again, to return to their villages or seek lost family. Greta packed what little she had, 2 patched blankets, a tin cup, and the flattened wrappers her boys had saved. She tried to leave them behind, thinking them foolish scraps, but Karl protested. "Mama, they are proof," that he said firmly. "Proof that we were given chocolate." Greta stared at him, stunned. Proof. For a child who had lived in ruins, sweetness itself had become something unbelievable, something that needed to be proven later. So she let him keep them. The family joined a column of civilians escorted by soldiers out of town. Mothers carried children on hips, bundles tied with rope. Some men limped on canes, others pushed carts with broken wheels. The convoy moved slowly down ruined roads, past fields where tanks rusted and houses stood roofless. At each stop, soldiers offered food, canned beans, powdered milk, and chocolate. Children cheered, their voices echoing against rubble. One old man muttered bitterly, "They bomb us, then feed us. A cruel balance." But Greta saw how the children's eyes shone, how their cheeks flushed with joy, and she could not deny the power of it. Memory and guilt. When Greta reached her parents' village, she found it half destroyed. Her childhood home was gone, only a blackened frame remaining. Her parents had died in a bombing raid months earlier. She stood in the ruins, her sons at her side, wrappers still tucked in Carl's pocket. That night, as they huddled under a makeshift roof, she whispered to her husband's memory. "Hans, forgive me. They gave our sons chocolate. They smiled at the enemy. But Hans, they smiled, and I cannot call that a sin." Guilt and gratitude warred within her. She had lost everything to the Americans' bombs, yet she had gained back her children's laughter through their chocolate. War had no easy truths. The children's stories. Over the following months, Greta noticed how children played a new game. They gathered in ruins, pretending to be soldiers, but instead of pointing sticks like rifles, they pretended to hand each other chocolate. "Here," Carl would say, crouching. "Take this. It will make you strong." The other children giggled, pretending to chew. For them, war was not only bombs and fear. War was also the day sweetness returned. Adults shook their heads, muttering that children forgot too quickly. But Greta saw it differently. They remembered what mattered most. A soldier's goodbye. Before leaving the occupied town, Greta saw one of the American soldiers who had given chocolate to Carl. He was young, barely older than a boy himself, freckles across his nose. He crouched again, pulling one last bar from his pocket, pressing it into Carl's hand. "Goodbye," he said in halting German. Carl nodded gravely, as though accepting a sacred gift. Later he split it in two, giving half to Lucas, half to Greta. "So we all remember," he said. Greta tasted her portion slowly, letting it melt on her tongue. She knew she would remember. Decades later. Time passed. Germany rebuilt. Cities rose from rubble. Children grew into men. Carl and Lucas had children of their own. But they never forgot the chocolate. At family gatherings, Carl often pulled out a small tin box. Inside were the wrappers he had saved as a boy, now yellowed with age. He would show them to his grandchildren, saying, "This was my proof. In 1945, the Americans gave us chocolate. When everyone said they would chain us, they gave sweetness instead." The children would laugh, not quite understanding. But Greta, now grey-haired and frail, would close her eyes, tasting again the first bite after years of hunger. Reflection. Historians spoke of surrender, of treaties, of the fall of Berlin. But Greta's family measured history in smaller ways, a bar of chocolate shared on a ruined street. For Greta, the shock of 1945 was not in cruelty. It was in mercy. It was in sweetness where only bitterness had been expected. Years later, when asked what she remembered most of the war's end, she did not speak of bombs or surrender or even of hunger. She spoke of her son's smile, sticky with melted chocolate. Legacy of sweetness. In her final years, Greta kept an wrapper tucked in her Bible. When she died, Carl found it pressed between pages of Psalms, faded, fragile, but still carrying the faint scent of cocoa. He showed it to his grandchildren and said, "This is more than paper. This is the day mercy tasted like sugar. This is how I learned enemies can be human." The children stared in awe. And so the story lived on. Not of chains, not of cruelty, but of chocolate,